George, we do have our next guest with us, and the honor of the introduction is yours.
Excellent. Well, Brian, I did kind of introduce you when we led into this next topic in our last segment. But Brian is he's the Director of Policy and Communications at the Center for Freedom and Prosperity. And Brian Garst is a smart fellow. He's got his master's in political science and security and diplomacy. He writes a great deal on these sorts of both domestic and international issues, and he's got a great paper out that discusses the International Criminal Court. It'll be released very soon, the next couple of days. And Brian, welcome to the show. We're glad to have you here.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Well, why don't you, first of all, just give us, if you will, almost a quick executive summary of what the problems with the International Criminal Court are. Because I think for a lot of us, we'd say, what's wrong with some sort of international court that cuts down on crime? And if why are you against having an international court that fights crime? Crime's a bad thing, and so anybody who fights crime is obviously doing a good thing. What's wrong with that initial reaction?
Right, and that's a very tempting attitude that I think a lot of people take. And so what I attempt to look at with the paper is both how the court has performed since it's been created, but also whether or not it was ever possible for the court to succeed. And what I find is that, for the most part, it was pretty much destined to fail. And I'll give you a couple examples why that is. One issue that the court deals with is that it's heavily politicized. And the reason for this is because it, one, relies on a very small set of nations for funding. So you have an institution that's supposed to be international that is necessarily run by bureaucrats who, like any other bureaucrat, they want to be paid and they want to continue to have a job. And that means that they have to continue to get funding. And so that means they're serving the interests of a very small set of nations.
Interesting. So how does that impact how it fights crime then? So what you're really saying is potentially, what I'm starting to hear is perhaps there are people who are guilty of crimes that get to skate because of where they come from.
Yes, that's a potential threat there, and when you're talking about something that's designed to embody the ideals of justice, well, one question is whose justice? Because that's not something that is necessarily shared by every country and culture exactly how justice is best served. And so you're already starting from the point of view that it's really representing European justice, because it's getting European funding.
Okay.
And
so
another issue of how it's politicized, and I think that you can more directly tie to its actual actions, is that it relies on the UN Security Council as a main source of input for its cases, essentially.
Interesting.
It was
so the UN.
This idea
Interesting.
That the
UN, I would say, is decidedly anti-Israel. Is there any reason we might expect that the ICC, if it were asked to get involved in essentially trying to investigate or prosecute Israel or perhaps Israeli soldiers or whatever it is they might do, is there any fear, or is it irrational of me to think, I think I know what's going on here? It sounds to me like another international group that wants to badmouth Israel. Israel gets incoming rockets all the time. No, not a word is said about it. Israel responds to stop the threat, and they all go crazy in talking about how awful they are.
Yeah, and the reason you feel that way is because you've seen how international organizations work in the past, and there's nothing in the ICC that insulates it from the same problems. So, in the case of
it's likely
Israel,
to give it the same pressures then.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
It's not. It's supposed to be independent, but it relies on the same funding mechanism and the political mechanism of the UN Security Council to operate. So to me, it sounds like it's all the same attitudes.
At the risk of, to me, it almost sounds like it's as bad as the U.S. Department of Justice.
Well, it might even be worse, because you look at the core set of crimes that it's supposed to be involved in, and they're all vaguely defined to begin with. how exactly do you determine a crime against humanity? It's you're giving somebody with a biased viewpoint the opportunity to see a crime where they want to and not see one where they don't want to.
Right. Okay. Well, let's just quickly try to get at this one question. You talked about how they can unfairly target a country. Do you have any examples you could give us, just so that our listeners have a better sense of what we're talking about when you tell us that the
absolutely.
ICC is sometimes unfair and political in its nature?
Right, and it's almost, when I talk about how it can be, unfair in its assessments, it's often not so much who they're going after as who they're not. And the reason for that is because of the Security Council. So, just recently there were some 60 nations that wanted Syria to be referred to the ICC. And 13 of the 15 members of the Security Council agreed, but the two who didn't have vetoes. They were China and Russia. They protect certain countries. North Korea, again, will never be referred to the court because China will never let it happen. On the other hand, you have countries in Africa that have no protection, so their cases automatically go through. And that's why every case ever brought before the ICC is in Africa, because it's the only area that they can get a case started in.
Right, that's interesting. So basically, because Africa doesn't have any client states that are willing to protect it, it gets prosecuted all the time and investigated all the time. But Syria and North Korea, of all places, or I'm assuming probably Iran as well, don't get investigated. And now that the administration... Let's turn this then on this whole question about Israel, because in the news I've seen some musings that the administration is considering changing its stance on protecting Israel from unfair UN actions. The UN is often, quite frankly, an anti-Semitic group that is constantly berating Israel for defending itself. And then the United States will often use its veto power to stop some of that foolishness, even though they certainly spend their time debating it and bad-mouthing them. And if we stop doing that, then essentially Israel gets singled out unfairly. Is that a real risk, or is that something that could happen with the ICC once we go to?
I don't think that's an unreasonable risk. That's certainly what the administration is banking on as they're trying to use that as a political chip, which just kind of goes to show how they view the ICC. Essentially, they think it's something to be used for politics, which I guess kind of confirms the general idea that it's not really a judicial body. Now, on the other hand, it could end up being an empty thread. The ICC, already struggling in the eyes of many to establish its legitimacy, might not necessarily want to wade into that issue. It kind of depends on the disposition of the prosecutors and whether or not they think they could survive that fight, which is an open question. But it's certainly based on the history of other attitudes from international bodies, a serious concern to Israel, and one that they took seriously as they tried to go after their funding, which, again, they recognized where the court is vulnerable.
Right. Well, it's interesting. I mean, you talked about the court being very political in nature. It strikes me that the issue between working out a peace accord with Israel and the Palestinian Authority is inherently political, very difficult and thorny. And while we all hope that there'll be a solution to that, it seems to me probably not likely to be helpful to the peace process to essentially be using these sorts of mechanisms to strong-arm Israel into something that is not in its best interest. Ultimately, what you probably need is some sort of agreement that has... for things to work, it has to be something that benefits both sides, not something that one side got slammed into. When you get slammed into something, it never really works out. You always resent it. And I think you kind of see at the end of World War I, some of those same factors bleed into World War II being started because one side got kind of hammered. So my point is, generally a reasonable accord is going to be better. And one of my fears is that they'll get used to mess things up, not help things. But
yeah, that's an excellent point. And one of the things I go into in the paper is that the International Criminal Court, in its very nature, often conflicts with other goals in international affairs. So in the case of Israel, if it comes in, you're right, it probably will make the peacekeeping process or the peacemaking process a lot more difficult. And in other cases they've gone into, they've done the exact same thing. For instance, when they indicted Sudan's leader al-Bashir, at the time there were peacekeeping talks going between leadership and rebel groups. And once the indictments came down, the rebels walked away from the table, because somebody else was already going after them. We don't have to compromise anymore. And you kind of get that attitude where both parties don't feel like they have to come to the table anymore.
Right.
And so the ICC can come in and actually make matters worse by trying to pursue what they term to be justice. Others might term revenge or something else, and no longer is peacekeeping the primary goal. And sometimes to reach peace, you have to be willing to let certain things go, for instance. I used the example of South Africa and their Truth and Reconciliation Commission after ARPACED. They could have come in and said, we're going to punish everyone who ever did anything wrong.
Right.
But they looked at the situation and said, that's not the best way to have peace going forward.
Right. Yeah, by doing that, then you have too many people who then fight the new system too much.
Right.
And if you want to have everyone kind of go, okay, we're going to start over, you just tell everyone we're going to have a clean slate here, we're going to start anew, we're not going to have retribution. That makes sense. But it's sometimes difficult, and that's probably where Nelson Mandela has to get some kudos, because he probably had every reason to be upset and want revenge, and he was willing to say, let's not go that direction. But these are complicated things, and I guess that's the point, is I see the ICC being used as a political hammer under the guise of justice and stopping criminality, when in fact all it really is just this political operation that is used or manipulated by people to push people they don't like into things that they don't want. And that's my fear, and it seems to me this administration is prepared to do that to our closest ally in that region.
Yeah, I'd say that's a pretty good summary of what's going on.
Well, Brian, we appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to share with us and give us a sneak peek, if you will, into your upcoming study. Where can we find that study when you're ready to release it? I understand it's going to be out on the 25th. Yes, we're looking to get that out tomorrow. It'll be on our website, freedomandprosperity.org. You can also just search for the Center for Freedom and Prosperity, and I'm sure it'll come right up. Excellent. Well, we appreciate your good work on this. This is an important issue, one that concerns us. If people want to go, in addition to your study, at our website at ff.org, we have a whole section where we kind of try to highlight the failures of the ICC and how, while its title might lead you to believe it's doing good things, it's actually not. And it's great to have an expert here to enlighten us. Thanks so much, Brian.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
All right, and you are listening.